Hey, Gary, thanks for joining us.
Such a pleasure.
Fantastic. So, today we're going to talk about some of your new work, which I had the pleasure to read yesterday. I found it very entertaining, I must say. I loved all the pop culture references. I haven't seen many management books that quote Game of Thrones, so I was very impressed when I saw that. I'm going to get straight to the meat of the book. And what I saw was a paradox that I felt the book was putting forward. On the one hand, it's saying that for a long time, companies have tried to create wealth and productivity by almost driving out employees and automating them and trying to fit them in as widgets. And we're reaching a point where we've sort of reached a law of diminishing returns where we have to find ways to get the best out of employees. Have I summarized the book for you?
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary. Yeah. I mean, we have a management model that was designed to turn human beings into robots. We've succeeded at doing it. Now that we have real robots, we can let human beings be human beings at work.
I like that. So I was thinking about this, right? This book, well, I'm not going to call it the book because I think it's bigger than a book. The idea, the concept, the genesis almost means we have to rethink why and how I don't like the word manage employees, but what we expect of employees.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Most organizations are still kind of bureaucratic at their
Yeah.
core. They still are built around these hierarchical organizations. Companies have 4, 6, 8 or more layers of management. And I think that management model, that mashup of command structures that go back, as far as human history, that mashup of kind of military command structures and then the principles of industrial
Yeah.
engineering, that's a product of the late 19th century when most
Yes.
employees were very poorly educated, when information was expensive to move, when scale was the primary advantage, when change kind of meandered along. None of those things are true anymore. And yet a lot of organizations are still stuck with models that literally were, designed to make human beings as reliable as the machines they served. And, there's definitely value in reliability and focus and efficiency and discipline for sure. And yet, as you said a moment ago, those things are kind of diminishing returns in terms of creating wealth and creating value. Now we need people who bring their initiative, their passion, their creativity to work. And most of the management system we have was designed to ensure that doesn't happen. In fact, Max Weber, the great apologist
Yeah.
for bureaucracy writing in the early 20th century, he said bureaucracy is perfected to the extent it is dehumanized.
Yes.
And you'd think, maybe that we should have escaped all this by now, but the data, Michael, says otherwise. You know what? Here's a couple of things we know. We know that only 17% of employees are engaged in their work, and we know that's not about the work, it's about the way they're managed. We know that only 1 in 5 believes their ideas, their opinions matter at work. About 1 in 10 says they have the freedom to experiment or try new things. And that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that 70% of all jobs require little or no originality, which says nothing about the people
Wow.
in those jobs and everything about the way those jobs
Yes.
were constructed.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned it in the book. So here's the thing, right? If we want to bring out the best in employees, this book is indirectly alluding to the fact that we've got to invest in employees from a young age to make sure they have the educational skills to be able to do their best work. Because the book talks that it sets the stage when people become employees. But you've got to look at what happens at educational levels, at university, high school, kindergarten, and so on. So is that something that you've been looking at, or does the book just take off from when they become employees?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is all embedded in a deeper challenge of, having an educational system that delivers people into employment that have the skills you need in the 21st century economy. And as we know, our schools often fail to do that. Having said that, I was talking a couple of weeks ago to John Ferriola. He just stepped down as CEO of Nucor, America's largest,
Yes.
most profitable steel company. And he said, and this is literally a direct quote, he said, Gary, I can take just about 99% of people that I find in small town America that show up in our factories, and we can teach them how to be world class at what they do.
Yes.
And he said the problem is not so much that people are not arriving with the right skills. We can teach those skills. The problem is that our organizations are still a caste system that basically assume credentials are the measure of a human being.
Well said. When you said we put too much emphasis on credentials, it's not the only education that matters.
Well, for sure not. And you see the companies that have turned on that human capability on the front lines, and there's a few things they have in common. One, they teach everyone to think like a business person.
Yes.
So, for example, if you join Southwest Airlines in your onboarding, you are going to learn about the economics of the airline industry. You're going to know exactly why load factor is important and why fuel costs are important. And you will know at any point in time how you're doing on all those parameters because it influences your bonus. So they teach people to think like business people. They give them the autonomy they need to solve problems right there wherever they work. They tend to organize those teams into small business units with their own P&L, so you really feel like you are an owner and you have a financial upside. Well, in 99.9% of organizations, some or all of those things are missing. And so, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't give people a financial upside, if you don't give them the chance to grow, if you don't invest in their skills as business people, and then you go like, well, we really can't trust these people to make important decisions. We have to micromanage them. And then guess what? Those people give up. They leave their passion and initiative at home. And then you turn around and say, we don't get much out of them. But one of the ways I like to think about this is economists, a lot of public policymakers, we talk about low-skilled jobs. And I have to say, I think that's entirely BS.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I agree with you.
What is a low-skilled job? Now, what they mean by that is these are jobs that don't require formal qualifications. That does not make it low-skilled. What makes it low-skilled is that people in those jobs have little opportunity over time to develop their skills, move on, and become more valuable. And so I like to think these are not low-skill jobs, no such thing, but there are a lot of low-opportunity jobs that are out there. And yet the companies that have figured out how to turn on that capability, they pay way above the average, not because they're just generous, but because their people are solving interesting problems and doing more than expected. So they pay above average, and they'll take on all comers. They'll beat anybody in the world. They're not afraid of global competition. They're not afraid of automation because their people are no longer robots. They're solving new challenges every day. So I think we've kind of painted ourselves into an intellectual corner there by thinking that the measure of a human being in the workforce is what's the degree, rather than what can you accomplish when we give you the tools and the environment to think and act like an owner.
I like that. I'm going to unpack some of those very useful points you raised so that the listener can understand each one and think it through, because you said a lot of useful things there. Let's start with the first one. The way management treats employees right now, it's as if they're a necessary evil. We don't really want you. Doesn't matter what we say about you. You're a big cost on our income statement, and we want to eliminate you as quickly as we can. And we're going to manage you in such a way that you're not very smart. We're going to tell you exactly what to do. And if you deviate from that for even 1 second, we're going to fire you. I mean, that's pretty much the way the world works today in corporate America, and not just America.
Yeah, sadly, Michael, that's really not much of an overstatement. You think about the fact that the average person you meet just about anywhere around the world today can probably buy a car or a scooter or something, but they buy their own transportation. Yeah. Many will buy their dwellings, depending on the country and so on. And yet those same people, when you put them at work, they can't buy a $100 chair without getting somebody's permission. And so we still have that overhang. And so many organizations are kind of an industrial caste system that distinguishes between managers and employees, between thinkers and doers, kind of the clever and the compliant. It makes no sense anymore. And at the heart of it is precisely what you were alluding to there. There is a unstated but a very deeply embedded belief. It's kind of like a paradigm. It's a worldview that says the organization hires human beings to produce products, services, and profits. So if you think about it, that sounds so simple, but in that little orientation there, it is a human being that's the instrument.
Yes.
The organization hires people. In fact, we call them human resources. What an awful thing. I'd love to ban that from business lexicon. And so all of the companies we profile in the book have turned that thing around. What they think is people join an organization to make a difference in the world and to earn a living, but the organization is the instruments through which people do together what they could not do alone. Yes. So I remember more than a decade ago when Zhang Rumin, chairman and CEO of Haier, the world's largest appliance maker based in Qingdao, China, unbelievably revolutionary management model, he visited me in my office in California. He'd read some of what I was doing at the time. And I'll never remember what he said. He said, I want to build a company where everyone gets to be a CEO because people are not a means to an end. They're an end in themselves.
Yes, I love that.
The first time I'd ever heard a CEO quote Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. But if you take Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines, Herb was famous for saying, every job is just as important as every other job. Now, there's a market out there, and so some skills are more valuable, they're more scarce than others, so they command a higher price in the wage market. But I can tell you, that does not make them inherently, more essential to creating value. And so Herb's view is like, we're all in this together, and then you act accordingly. So people very quickly in any organization, you get a sense of what is the prevailing view. Is the prevailing view that people are a resource, or is the prevailing view is the organization is an instrument that we use together to do something extraordinary? And if it's the former, you're almost lost before you've begun. So I think everything in the book that we write about starts with that fundamental rethink. What is the position of human beings vis-a-vis their organizations?
Yeah, and the point you make in the book, and you've raised now very well, is that whenever we talk about raising the salaries of people who, in inverted commas, do non-essential or routine work like a barista at a Starbucks and so on, the prevailing view is that we're doing charity by raising their salary. But what you're saying, and what you explain with a lot of case studies, is that when you're raising their salary, you're also teaching them to add more value. So the net effect for the company is that it's profitable even though you're paying them more.
Well, and absolutely. And it's not about paying them more for the same work. It's paying them to bring their brains to work and to solve problems, right? So I think if you take a Starbucks, you brought them up, so let's stick with that. There are a couple hundred, I'm sure, critical jobs that are required to make a Starbucks work. From how clean it is, to how well the coffee is made, to the kind of greeting people come in, to where the furniture is laid out, to how the online order, all of these things. Yeah. And I can tell you, every single person there, if you invest in them, you give them the opportunity, they're going to have ideas on how to do that better. Every single one of those stores, if you think about it that way, will be a laboratory where people will be every day saying, how do we experiment with something different? We don't want to degrade the customer experience. We're not going to take a financial risk. But, we trained 70,000 people in this retailer, gave them all an online platform where every day they can, here's my idea, here's what we're trying. And so you turn the entire company into laboratory, entire company into this problem-solving engine, because here's the mistake I think a lot of people write and think about the impact of automation make. They assume there is some finite number of routine jobs to be performed in the economy. That's probably true. You only need so many truck drivers or so many whatever it be. The mistake they make is to assume there's some finite number of interesting problems to solve in the world.
Yes.
So, Toyota's employees generate more than 1 million improvement suggestions a year.
Wow.
Right? There's a reason nobody over 40 years has caught Toyota in terms of the quality of manufacturing. There are other things in their business they could probably be better at, maybe innovation, a few other things. But in terms of at least their manufacturing, they said, we are going to invest in everybody and teach them how to become an inspired problem solver. You start to say, well, how do you give people the financial upside? So, I'm all for raising the minimum wage within, I guess, some reason. But the real question is not about how do we raise the minimum wage, it's how do you give people the opportunity to create more value than you might have expected. Back to Nucor, every employee at Nucor, they have a bonus system that's tied into capital productivity. So Nucor buys a big piece of expensive equipment, it puts it there, it has some rated capacity of tons per hour or whatever it may be. And once you hit that kind of rated capacity, any additional productivity you're able to wring out of that equipment, a big part of that productivity gain goes back to the employees who are lying awake at night, thinking about, so you'll have somebody who tell the story in the book, and it's one story of thousands at Nucor, of somebody who's looking at one of the big ladles that moves molten metal, and every so often you have to disassemble it, and it has a liner in it, the liner erodes, you have to change out the liner, the supports on it have to be changed. So somebody's looking at that going like, is there a way to make this last longer? Could we line this with a lighter material that puts less weight and less strain on the joints? And so this person on their own bat is talking to metallurgists, talking to ceramicists, talking to people around the world, figuring out how we might do this, ordering stuff in, running small-scale experiments, perfecting this, and then saving the company a bunch of money. A huge part of that productivity gain goes back to that individual. Mm-hmm. Right? So what incentive do people have? And in most organizations, there's very, very little incentive because we've already decided before we even began that they really cannot make much of a difference to the business.
Yes, and just for the readers, Gary he's mentioned Nucor, he's mentioned Hire. Those case studies are in a lot of detail in the book. There's also a case study of Handelsbanken, which I liked. There was a case study of Michelin and Southwest Airlines. So if you want to know more about them, the book has the details. But coming back to this, Gary, I think let's get into sort of the details of how to bring this about. Because A lot of managers, a lot of corporate executives believe firmly that it is their role to sit in an office in New York or Chicago to come up with a detailed set of instructions and best practices which they email to a branch in San Francisco, New Mexico, and it needs to be followed to the letter. Now, you and I agree that there's no way a head office in New York can know all of the variability in every single location and be a perfect fit for customer needs. But if someone is listening to this, what would you tell them as they try to change their thinking about this?
Well, there are layers here for sure. Let's start at the top. I mean, without doubt, in every organization, you need control. And bureaucracy and that hierarchical, rule-driven, legacy organization, that's the technology of control. It's how do you make sure that people are following the rules? When we began to build large companies and employees came together, we quickly realized, at least at the time, that you needed this kind of super employee called a manager who was going to be the enforcer. Frederick Taylor talked about the fact that enforcement. And so they were the ones that made sure that people were following the product standards, the safety standards, the work rules, and so on. So, fine, control is important. I think of, the next generation of iPhone, probably announced later this year, is probably going to run on either 5 nanometer or 7 nanometer silicon chip, systems on a chip. Well, 5 nanometer is the length that your fingernail is going to grow in the next 5 seconds. So how much control do you need over how many variables to be able to do something at that scale? I am an enormous fan of control. The question is, how do you get it? In the old model, you got it by a lot of oversight, very narrowly constructed jobs, a lot of SOPs, predefined rules, which is great, except you completely kill any capacity for innovation and improvement. The way we get control is, A, we give people the skills so they can manage themselves. That means they do have to be smart business people. You give them real-time data so they know exactly on how their little part of the business is doing. You hold them accountable. They have a financial stake in making that thing better. Their performance is visible to everyone in the organization, so there's no place for poor performance or mediocrity to hide. And you find that when you do that, you do not need many managers. One of my favorite stories in the book, and it's just inspiring no end to me as somebody who had a first job in healthcare, is a Dutch home health provider, Burzorg. They employ 16,000 nurses and home health givers. They are by far the most efficient healthcare organization in the Holland. They beat everybody in terms of patient satisfaction, cost, and so on. They have the lowest possible turnover. They've been voted Dutch Employer of the Year 5 times in a row. And you see a business of 16,000 employees. They're divided into small teams of 12 nurses. Within those teams, they've divided up all the managerial roles. You have somebody called a treasurer, somebody called a housekeeper, somebody called a mentor. So they're doing the work of managing in those teams. And then they're connected together on a social platform called WeLink. And if you have a question you can't answer, you put that out there and you have 16,000 other people, and the performance of every one of those little teams is visible around the whole company. So if you're falling behind, people are going to know it. They'll probably offer to help. You're going to know who's doing better. You go find them. I do not need heavy-handed control mechanisms there. And in that company, they operate a 16,000 person company with about 50 on-demand coaches, with a central staff of 50 people, mostly in IT. And get this, Michael, 2 managers.
Wow.
That's a span of control of 1 to 8,000. And they're delivering a complex product with all kinds of safety issues, ethical issues, and yet they're doing it with almost zero bureaucracy. So if somebody tells me this cannot be done, I just think no, it can be done. I've seen it. And so, you still need all that control. You need nurses who are very clued into professional standards, who are responsible for making sure that if I have to start an IV or if I have to help somebody out of their chair, how do I do it safely? They understand the protocols. They're all there. You can look at them and you're expected to do that. But I don't have somebody riding herd on you. You're an adult, and when you're accountable and when your performance is transparent, I don't need a lot of people looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, I like that example because it's an example of an industry that is literally life and death, highly regulated. There's a lot of room for a big blow up, but the model works. And one thing I found consistent across all the case studies is that there doesn't seem to be a central R&D function. Everyone is part of R&D, and everything's pushed down to the operating units, whereby I like the Nucor example, whereby they treat every facility as its own P&L. And if demand drops, it's the role of everyone in that facility to go out there and find a way to fix the business. And they do it. There's no one telling them they have to do it because the incentives are tied to the performance. But coming back to this, it seems as if it's not just command and control of management decisions has to be decentralized. It seems that you have to train your employees at the front line to think about R&D, to teach them how to read an income statement and balance sheet, to teach them how to do conflict resolution, how to sell. It's about pushing all those skills to the front line as much as possible and keeping a very, very bare bones management structure.
Yeah, I learned that more than a decade ago when I made my first visit to Morningstar. It's the largest tomato processor in the United States. I think they have around 600 or 700 employees. But the first time I was there, I realized they have not even a single manager. Employees write contracts with each other every year. They report to each other. And I went to the founder, Chris Rufer. He's the president of the company, but he refuses to take the role of CEO. Yeah. But I said, Chris, this is unbelievable. You have a company with no managers. And he looked at me and said, Gary, I think you missed the point. I have a company where everybody's a manager.
Yeah.
And so what we've done is we've taken all those manager roles that Peter Drucker and others talked about, and we've just simply distributed to the people that have to do the work of managing right there every day. And so, again, it does take training. You don't give people this accountability until they're ready to have it. But the alternative is really that you infantilize an entire workforce. And let's not pretend that these skills are so complicated that it's impossible for people to master them. They're not. They're mostly fairly basic skills. But if you start to do that, you do create a question: what's the role of all these managers? When the Chinese company Haier, when they migrated their new model, they redeployed 12,000 middle managers. Those jobs simply do not exist anymore. Now, most of those managers moved into these small little micro enterprises, as they call them, very entrepreneurial cells, but there's no managerial jobs left to do because all the managing is still getting done, but it's not getting done by a professional cast of administrators. Yes. And the reason I like that model, I like what I see at Birdsong, what I see at Nucor, is that you are essentially turning every single employee into a business person.
Yes.
And as you know, Michael, in the last few years, for all kinds of good reasons, which you may want to come back to, in the last few years, there's a lot of debate about whether capitalism is in crisis. Mm-hmm. And for sure, in some ways it is, which we could definitely talk about properly. But here's what I think. I think the real problem with capitalism is we don't have enough capitalists. Yes. We have too many employees and not enough people who think like owners. Yeah. And changing that is not, despite all the big fans of ESOPs and so on, changing that is not primarily a matter of giving somebody like 0.0000002% of the shares of the company. It's a matter of giving employees the two things that define entrepreneurship: the right to make business and critical decisions and a financial stake in your success. Mm-hmm. You do that, and you can have a company filled with what I would call micropreneurs, however big you are.
Yeah, because if you look at businesses today, most of them focus heavily on perfecting a process, refining it and passing it down the organization, and they really value and defend that process. But as the book says, it's about the principles that you need to get right. You need to make sure everyone's aligned in the principles. You've got to teach them how to manage a business, and you've got to give them an incentive. Now, the interesting thing is that I've never really read of a company that's failed miserably doing that.
Because every single person, as you were mentioning from the Nucor example, Michael, every single person feels accountable for the company's success. Think about this for a moment. In most organizations, there is a tiny minority of employees whose compensation is at risk depending on competitive success and customer satisfaction. In the companies I was describing, everybody's compensation is at risk. At Nucor, let's say I'm a little micro enterprise with 20 people, and my job is to make and sell 3-door refrigerators. So I contract with other micro enterprises inside of Nucor to do that. I'll contract for some design help, for some R&D help. Maybe I need to hire some new people. I'll contract for manufacturing, but I'm literally writing contracts with other internal micro enterprises. Now, every one of those contracts has a performance clause in it that has a big bonus, a big upside that depends on the success of that product in the marketplace. So if the product doesn't succeed, guess what? R&D doesn't get their bonus. HR doesn't get their bonus, and so on. So the moment it becomes clear, hey, maybe we're going to run into a problem, you have everybody, rather than finger pointing, it's not my problem. That was marketing. That was sales.
Yeah.
You got the whole group of people swarming that problem and saying, how do we fix this? And so you have this terrible conceit that, somehow it's the CEO who's responsible for strategy and direction. Well, if so, the rest of us can just like sit back and hope that that person is steering the company in the right direction. By the way, history says that's a very risky bet. There's a CEO from a very well-known, probably Fortune 50 company. Read this just a couple of months back in Harvard Business Review. He said, there are certain opportunities that only the CEO can see and big calls that only they can make. I think that's rubbish, right?
I
All
agree.
the evidence says the CEO is likely to be the last to know.
He's so far removed from the
They're
front
insulated by
line.
layers of kowtowing executives who want to bend reality to fit the prejudices of the leader. They're not every day out there with the next generation of customers, understanding their needs, what's going on. And so you see it, and I'm not picking on any individual person or organization, but I see it again and again and again, that when you have an organization that's mostly paralyzed to drive change and so on, if you wait for a problem or opportunity to be big enough to finally break through the orthodox thinking, to finally capture the scarce attention of the CEO, you are by definition behind the curve, which is why virtually every change program is a catch-up program.
I like that example. Another way of thinking about this, and another good example, is if you look at the former Soviet Union and you contrast it with what the Chinese are doing. The Soviets were very centrally organized. 5-year plans, no one could think, no incentives, right? There were no incentives in the former Soviet Union for anyone to get off the stool and fix anything. And that's why, the products were not so good. But if you look at China now, and you use the example of hire, they understand that you need an incentive model. You need to pass ownership. So, when someone says, hey, you know what, I'm not sure this will work, I think you've got two very good examples of where we've seen over 50 years what happens without incentives in place.
Well, you're right. And the fact is that the average Global 1000, Fortune 500, whatever company is actually way more like the Soviet Union inside than it is like an open marketplace. And I think there was a time, Michael, where you could get away with this.
Yes.
But it reflects a kind of arrogance. In fact, the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, I think he had a way of talking about this. I'm going to get it wrong, but here was the idea. The idea was it is easy to believe that you understand more of a situation than you do, that you have more knowledge and information than you actually have. And the way I see that manifesting it in companies, I'll give you an example. I was talking to Jim Schnabe, who was a co-CEO of SAP, the big German software company. Now is the non-exec chairman of Maersk, a Danish logistics company, shipping company, and Siemens. And he said that when he left SAP, they had more than 50,000 KPIs, right? Key performance indicators. So the arrogance that lies behind that is that we're smart enough at the top to deconstruct the entire performance process, to define these very synthetic goals that are not, they don't relate to a P&L. They're like, we need to sell more of this product line, that product line. We need to capture more of customer X or Y. So you have these synthetic goals. And the arrogance is that if everybody does exactly what they say against all of those disaggregated goals, somehow that will reaggregate into success. Well, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so the organizations that I'm describing in the book, they say, listen, we don't know enough about the top to build like a top-down performance model. There's just too much complexity, too many things going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to give people a few simple incentives, make sure where they know where the boundary lines are in terms of ethics and so on, and then incentivize them on the front lines to make the smart trade-offs, to run after growth, to do whatever's required to make the customer happy. There's a reason, and again, if I get this slightly wrong, I'm obviously not looking at the book, but I believe that United Airlines has, their employee manual has something like 60 pages in it. Wow. Southwest has 5 pages. It's about all that you need to know, right? One is saying, let me trust, I'm going to train the heck out of my people. I want to know that they have great values. I want to make sure they love the company, and then I got to let them go. And the other says, gee, we really can't trust anybody. I think for many CEOs, the idea that the future of your company depends on the capacity of ordinary human beings to use their judgment every day is like almost too scary to contemplate.
Yes. Yeah.
But the alternative is institutionalized idiocy, right? Where you are trying to run things by remote control from the top, and you are going to find you are wrong way more times than average.
I don't know much about United, but if you look at any company that has a 60-page rule book, that's a bunch of rules. But if you've got a company that has 2 or 3 pages, it's a set of principles. They don't prescribe what to do. They just tell you this is how we want you to think about it. This is what is close to our heart. Use this as your North Star or some guide, but we can't tell you what to do.
As you mentioned earlier, as I argue in the book, I think, and I understand why, but in a lot of organizations, there's a kind of myopic fixation on processes and practices.
Yes.
And they're important, right? I mean, there's at Morningstar, even though they don't have any managers, there's a way, there's a process, there's a discipline that is used when employees negotiate contracts with one another. It's not a free-for-all. There's a way of doing it, and it evolves over time. And no, you can't just change how that gets done on a whim. So I have no problem with that. The dilemma is that if you look at the companies that have really broken that old model, and what I find interesting, Michael, is some of these companies like Gore, they've been around a long time, and dozens of case studies have been written about them. Right now, there are a lot of case studies about hire. And what I find curious is, all right, so why haven't more companies followed suit? And here's part of the answer. It's a fairly complicated answer. Here's part of the answer. Often when we go to benchmark other companies, the question you ask is, what do they do differently?
Yes.
When the real question should be, how do they think differently?
I like that.
If you look at hire, almost every process you see there is just mind-bendingly different than what you'd expect to find in a typical bureaucracy. From how they contract to one another, to how they hire, to how they choose their leaders, to how they leverage ideas from outside of the firm, and just like everything you look at is different. And so what I've seen happen again and again, more traditional companies will go look at some of these vanguard organizations and they'll get enamored about boy, I really like the way they do performance reviews. I really like the way they do planning. So they bring that particular practice back and then they try to graft it onto the old bureaucratic rootstock and wonder why the graft doesn't take.
Yeah.
Or use another analogy, it's like it's trying to put a 2 on a dog, hoping you'll make it a ballerina.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, you just have a stupid-looking dog. And so that's why, and this is really the core of the argument, one of the core arguments of the book, is that in any field of human endeavor, you ultimately reach a point where you cannot solve the new problems with the old principles. Right? There is no way to understand the subatomic world if you start with Newtonian physics. Doesn't make Newtonian physics wrong.
Yes,
it just says, you have to come with completely new thinking around indeterminacy and non-local correlation and superposition, all the other. And I think that's where we are today with management. As long as we're tweaking systems and processes, but the underlying DNA, the DNA of specialization, standardization, hierarchy, formalization, routine, as long as that's the core DNA of the organization, nothing gets better. No organization ever gets fundamentally better than it is right now. So you have to go back and say, okay, if I want to build something that is resilient, if I want something that is an engine of creativity, if I want something that instills daring and passion in people, what principles would I start with? And the ones we talk about in the book are, principles like experimentation, openness, meritocracy, and community. And then, and this is true of all these organizations we've been talking about, they start with those kinds of principles. And then sometimes over decades, they start to say, right, if we took the principle of meritocracy or openness or experiment, if we took that seriously, what would we do differently? And they simply start to elaborate that thing out, over time. Let me give another analogy. Let's say you're looking at a couple that's just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. It's like super happily married, just like an amazing marriage that's worked really well. And you say, okay, I want to go study that. So what you do is you spend like a week in the household and you go, well, isn't that interesting? He says thank you like many times a day. She comes over and just puts his hand on his shoulder and says, how are you doing? And so at the end of it, I have like these 6 things they did. And then you say, okay, that's it. That's like what no, that's not. There's something way deeper in the heart that's driving that. And you can't extract these few exterior things. But again and again, we do that. So we have to, really go back to that worldview. How do you think about people at work? And back to first principles.
Well, you mentioned in the book very well, I can't remember where, but isn't it the most American thing in the world to unleash the freedom and boldness of your employees? So if I'm an American CEO, American manager, all we're doing is asking these guys to go back to what is American, right? The land of the free, the home of the brave. Give people some freedom, give them some guidelines, give them some incentives, and they'll do good things.
Well, that's the irony.
It's the irony, isn't it?
Book to hire. The irony is, I went to China and found the most capitalist company I've ever seen on the face of the planet. And obviously, China is still run by the Communist Party, and they have a huge drag on their economy still, incredibly bureaucratic state-owned enterprises that they're trying to shake up. And I know the leadership in China wishes a lot of those enterprises were emulating higher. It's not so easy to do. But yeah, that's kind of the irony. And so when people critique capitalism, and I have my own critique for sure, but I say, the real problem with capitalism is we don't have enough capitalists.
Yes.
And I'll just keep banging on that refrain, because when you start to see every single person as a potential entrepreneur, every single person as a potential business owner, I mean, here's what we know, Michael. We know that 77% of Americans would like to run their own business.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask them why, it's simple. I want control over my destiny. I want a shot at the brass ring. Okay, cool. 77%. And yet we wrongly assume that the only way that can happen is if those people take the huge financial risk and go off and start their own company, which is great, go for it. But what we really have to ask is not how do we get more startups? How do we have more entrepreneurial enclaves like Silicon Valley? We have to say, how do you light the fire of entrepreneurship in every single organization, large and small, and even in the public sector?
Yeah, but what you're saying is right. I want to just unpack that for the audience, right? Because you've said it a few times. You said that the problem with capitalism here and many places, we don't have enough capitalists. But what you're saying is not that we need more CEO capitalists. We've got to treat all employees, even the ones that are right at the front line who supposedly earn the least amount of money, as capitalists, empower them to make decisions, to think for themselves, and give them a share of the incentive. That's the key thing, right?
Think about the last few months, few years. Basically, around the world, the establishment has taken a beating. Mm-hmm. And that can be more from the right, all the drain the swamp folks who vote for Trump. It could be from the left, all the young indebted college grads that would like to give socialism another chance and were big supporters of Bernie. It is the Brexiteers in Britain. It's the Yellow Jackets in France. It's the Five-Star Movement in Italy. It goes on and on. And interestingly, whether you kind of think of yourself on the left or the right, what unites these people is not ideology. What unites them is a sense that the system no longer works for them, if it ever did, including all the recent protesters calling for racial justice. And so we know in 2016, just before the last presidential election in the United States, 92% of American voters said the system is rigged primarily for the benefit of large corporations, the bankers and the rich. 2 months ago, spring of 2020, a Harris poll found that only 29% of Americans said that right now capitalism is working for the average worker. And guess what? They are right? They are right. We have 44% of the workforce, 53 million Americans in so-called low-wage jobs. That proportion is going up. We know that every generation since World War II, a smaller proportion of young people in every succeeding generation makes it into the middle class. We know that the bottom 50% of Americans have only 1% of the wealth. So there's a reason people are upset. And unfortunately, it's gotten hugely politicized because politicians are basically people whose livelihoods depend on channeling grievances into their political party. But the fact is, every human being that I've ever met, any country, they want three things. They want dignity. Yeah. They want to feel as if they matter. And number two, they want opportunity. They want to feel like there is a route where my life can get better. And they want equity. They want to have that sense that I've been treated fairly.
Yes.
And, data we talked about earlier suggests, more than suggests, that people often do not find that at work. And if you don't find dignity and opportunity and equity at work, it's pretty hard, I think, to find enough of it in the rest of your life to kind of compensate for that fact. And if this wasn't enough to worry about simply from a social perspective, what you see across the OECD over the last 20 years now is declining productivity growth, which makes it all worse. Mm-hmm. It fuels populism, it creates more income inequality. At the same time as productivity has been going down, bureaucracy has been growing. We lay out the data in the book. 1983 to 2018 in the United States, the size of the bureaucratic class more than doubles, while all other categories of employment go up by less than 50%. And that's not primarily government regulation driving, the endless increase in managers, administrators, and so on. It's just the self-perpetuating nature of bureaucracy itself. And so I think there are competitive reasons to care about this. You can't build a globally competitive enterprise today unless you are capturing every bit of human imagination and so on. I think there's an ethical or a moral or a social reason to care about it. You can't have an economy or country in which many people feel they don't have that opportunity to get ahead. And I think there's an economic reason to care about it, because if we're ever going to get the productivity engine starting again, what we have to do is unleash a lot of this latent capability that's just not getting used.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this case study you had in the book of Michelin, the tire company, because it is all about how do you implement this. And I can imagine a lot of people listening to this are going to say, well, we've consistently run our company top down. This sounds difficult. Now, you've given the example of China, and you obviously know China very well. I'm sure you know Vietnam very well as well. Another communist country, but probably the most capitalist people I've ever seen in my life. Now, both countries, I may be wrong on the numbers on China, but I think China started opening up in 1978. So they've only been exposed to capitalism for just over a generation, and they seem to have embraced it better than anyone else I've ever seen. So here's a country that doesn't know capitalism, but seems to be doing very well at embracing it and doing well at using the principles for their benefit. So what would be the lessons for someone here who wants to take this concept and roll it out? Everyone's going to say it's hard, but there are examples of companies and countries doing it very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, what do you see in some of these countries? I see some of this happening in India as well. What you see is, just like they did with other technologies, they're leapfrogging. They're saying, right, we haven't had 100 years for all that bureaucratic thinking to be embedded in our business schools. And, we don't have these 100-year-old organizations that have grown up and with all the layers and so on. And so, why would you do that? So you see that capitalistic spirit in a kind of a pure form. Yeah. Now, having said that, some of those cultures have a pre-communist history of being great traders and entrepreneurs and so on. So it's not like, that wasn't there in the culture, although it had been submerged for a long time. So you're absolutely right. But by the way, this is a spirit you find around the world.
That's true. Yeah.
If you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, go look at any sort of a souk, a bazaar, a market, and you'll find people out there haggling and trading, and farmers and craftspeople and artisans and so on, figuring out what can I sell to my neighbors and what. I mean, this is not something that has any particular country. This is who we are as human beings, and yet you can damp that down through a command and control political system. You can damp it down through command and control organizations. But it's kind of there. It's built into us. And it's something, as much as anything, you have to unleash it rather than have to spend a lot of time thinking of how you're going to cultivate it. But in terms of getting started, the thing I think that's made it difficult, a couple of things that make it difficult, because we've thought a lot about why this seems so hard when in many ways it shouldn't be. So I'll give two things. One is, if you think about it, bureaucracy is a massive multiplayer game. And the game is played for the currency of positional power and then the salary and perquisites that come with that. So unfortunately, though, winning the game of bureaucracy doesn't necessarily create a lot of value, because the skills you need to develop to be kind of like a level 10, bureaucrat is skills like hoarding resources, negotiating targets, protecting your turf, deflecting blame, managing up. So you learn how to do all of those things. And great, and you get ahead. One of the most disturbing statistics in our polling, Michael, was that 76% of employees believe the primary way you get ahead in their organization is to be a better bureaucrat. But if you believe it's true, where's your energy going to go? But here's the dilemma. Once I've spent 10 or 20 or more years learning how to play that game, and like I'm now an EVP, SVP, whatever, somebody comes along and says, hey, Gary, we got to change the game. Right now, your power is going to depend on pure attested value added. If you're a leader, it's only going to be because people want to follow you. If people don't think you're adding value, your subordinates can vote you off the island. That's a very disconcerting message, right? We tell this story in the book. Pope Francis came. He assumed he became pontiff, vowing to dismantle much of the Catholic bureaucracy, much of the church's bureaucracy, the curia, and so on. And opening up the church and making it more responsive to the problems and the challenges around the world, making it more internally honest about its own failings. And so that was, I guess, 2013. A few months ago, someone said, how's it going? And he said, I feel like it's like trying to clean the Sphinx with a toothbrush. And my argument is, you better get more toothbrushes. Because what a lot of leaders find when they really start to think about this is, even with all the will in the world, they cannot make these changes from the top down.
Yes.
They do not have enough hours in the day to go one VP at a time and say, we need you to be a champion for humanocracy. We need you to think about how you dismantle all these systems and processes getting people away. We need you to give up your positional power. We need you to go from, manager to mentor, right? You do not have enough hours in the day to convince people to give up that power. And so where we've seen this succeed, and this is assuming you don't have like an immensely powerful CEO who can just make this happen through fiat, we think it has to be much more grassroots. So our sense is the way you defeat bureaucracy is not like with some all-powerful CEO or in some like Armageddon kind of battle, but it's when ordinary people across the organization say enough. And when they say, let me, right where I am, my team, right here, let me take one of these principles and see how it applies here, right? Maybe I only have a team of 10 people I'm working with. What would it mean if we were more open? What would it mean if we were more of a meritocracy? What would it mean if I give up my power? So what the story we tell in Michelin is, one guy, until recently, been a factory manager. He was working at the time in corporate HR. But one guy goes around and he recruits about 38 frontline supervisors in a year-long experiment to give their power away. And so he didn't know how this is going to play out. There was no like big corporate change program, because the moment if you kind of announce that goal from the top, or you start with a whole bunch of EVPs, you're going to create a wall of resistance. So this guy started out on the front lines. And guess what? These people discovered frontline supervisors. When I give some of my authority away and my teams become more capable, my job gets better. I don't think anybody really gets off being a micromanager, or not many people get off on that. How hard it is to manage toddlers and even teenagers. Like, we are relieved when they start to grow up and make their own choices, right?
Yes.
And yet, there's a reason that managers are less engaged than their subordinates. That's Gallup data. Because managers, they get it from the top, just like employees. But now I have to be kind of an asshole half of the time. And I have to be their micromanaging adult, infantilizing them. That's like not a comfortable. So what they found at Michelin is when you help people learn how to give away their power, how to equip their frontline teams and make that transfer, everybody's job gets better. The managers and supervisors now have problems to work on more interesting challenges of growth or helping this team to develop, but I'm no longer getting woken up at 3 a.m. by the third shift who, has personnel issues they can't handle. So I think it's a very challenging kind of sticking point to get over as you ask people to give up their power and rethink their roles. But the fact of the matter is, our experiences as people do that, everybody's work, gets better.
So let's unpack this, right? Because it's very, very important. So we have a lot of consulting partners and consultants who listen to this channel. And one of the hallmarks of management consulting is that change starts and is driven at the top. Every consultant tells you that, right? But what I'm hearing you saying, and I like what you're saying, is that the role of the CEO needs to start the process, but he can't drive it because he just doesn't have there's no way for him to do it. So he's got to create an environment where it's safe for employees to experiment, for employees to speak up, for employees to feel that if I fail at this, I'm not going to be severely punished provided I don't do something totally ridiculous. So the role of a CEO in this kind of environment is to create that environment and create almost a safe space for people to experiment. Is that a good way of summarizing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Michael. It's exactly right. The problem is there are certain kinds of things where it can just be implemented.
Yeah.
Get the darn thing done, right? There's like a recipe, whatever. But there are other things that have to be invented. And there is now no mechanical process of building a humanocracy. Now, there's a way of getting from here to there, but there's not a plug and play. There's not a manual. And that's a good thing, too. And let me suggest why. I wrote a piece many, many years ago, but I wrote an article for Harvard called Strategos Revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think it was one of the first articles that talked about business model innovation and said that the most important thing about any strategy is how it's different from every other strategy. So today, I don't think any CEO would say, I want a strategy that's an exact copy of somebody else's, right? I mean, we all know that you have to work hard to create a highly differentiated strategy that has a chance of producing highly differentiated results. And you can't simply say like, well, let's copy Netflix or let's copy Apple or whatever. Now, interestingly, so I think people today, they get that around the business model, but they don't get that around the management model.
Yes.
So, what I book is, I don't say, go do the same kind of internal contracting hires do. Go figure out they call it the value added adjustment. Go figure out that. No. Do not do that. But start instead with the principle behind it. Markets, internal markets, everybody accountable to a customer, everybody being paid by customers. And so the challenge in any organization as you make this shift is you have to invent humanocracy for yourself. And there are principles that will guide you. We know what those principles are, but exactly how those are going to work and play out, how are they going to play out in resource allocation and goal directing and compensation and teaming in your organization? I sincerely hope that's a little bit different than how that's working at Nucor or one of these other companies, because if not, there's no competitive advantage in it. If you're doing basically the same way everybody else is. And so, the kind of consultant top-down model of change works when you're trying to do something that's really familiar and it's been done 50 times and like, okay, yeah, just like go do it. But I can tell you, it doesn't work for strategy. It's interesting. Think about it. Fewer and fewer consultants are doing real strategy work.
Yeah.
Because strategy, we now know, is no longer about planning, right? They moved all into IT and digitization and so on, because that's more recipe driven. I can scale it up, right? And we know from McKinsey, from BCG, from Bain, they are all united around one fact, and that is that 75% of change programs fail. So what we've tried to do is we've been thinking through this, and this is not just armchair. We're doing this in some very large, complicated organizations. But our approach to this is get 10,000 or 3,000 or 500 or whatever your organization, get those people all online, start to get them to talk about these core principles. Have them spend a week thinking about what would it mean if we were more open, and ask them to kind of be practical. How would that change our management model? So somebody's going to say, well, if we were more open, we'd share salary data. Some will say, well, if we were more open, we'd bring customers in much earlier in the development process. Somebody said, if we're more open, our whole planning process would be open to frontline employees. So you'll have like dozens, and where we do this, we get thousands of kind of little hacks where people are saying, gee, if that really, we want that to be in our DNA, this needs to change. And then you do peer review. You ask people, which of these seems like something that would really make a difference. You ask those people to work that up into a little prototype, a little test, something can be done in a few weeks with a minimal amount of money. And then you go test this. And you say, well, did that make a difference? Did people, and we have some very good examples of these little management hacks in the book. But I think that's the way you tackle this. I mean, the way you evolve anything very complex is through experimentation, right? Nobody designed the ecosystem of the entire web top down. What emerged with Amazon and Alibaba and Airbnb and Facebook? I mean, that emerged with, there was a platform underneath it, right? There was a few simple rules about but that emerged through conscious experimentation. That's how we're going to have to build bureaucracy. So my dream is that in a year or 2 or 5, no one will ever again use the word cascade when they talk about change.
I like that.
And that the change will roll up, not out, because I believe that in the future, virtually every effective change program will need to be socially constructed. The world is simply too complex for that to happen. I'll give you 2 quick parallel examples, 2 quite lovely examples. So I was in the office of head of sales for one of the world's biggest tech companies. I already know them. At that time, I had about 12,000 people in sales, and they just changed the whole sales compensation model. I said, how'd that go? He said, like, it produced a poop storm. And he said, we had a lot of good people leave and a huge blowback, and it was like disaster. I said, well, did you blog about it first? Were you out there having a conversation? Here's what I'm thinking I'm seeing. What do you guys think? What do you suggest? He says, no, that would have taken too long. So I said, great. You were able to drive something out there in 3 months, but now you're going to spend a year or 2 or 3 trying to undo the damage. And so I take that as one example. I look at what Diane Gerson, we don't tell the story in the book, but it's a video we're going to have up that people can watch. Diane Gerson, HR at IBM, a few years ago, they were trying to rethink their performance management system. And instead of them getting like a few smart consultants and people in the room and say, let's figure this out in all our wisdom, they basically ran a company-wide hackathon. And they said, what pisses you off about the old model? How does it get in the way of your ability to deliver value to customers or to innovate or just have a good time at work? And they got an immense kind of diagnosis. Okay, guys, what would you suggest that we change it? How do we make some of these critical trade-offs? And this thing was co-created in a very interesting way. And at the end of it, everybody knows why you got there. Everybody knows why certain decisions were made and not others, because there are trade-offs, but they at least know the evidence and how we looked at them. Everybody feels they have a stake in creating that, and nobody feels that they were just like, they had, the corporates coming down one more time with their tablets of wisdom to tell them what to do. So that to me is much, much more the model for the future. And what we lay out in the book is, how do you start to hack your own little team?
Yes.
But how do you scale that up? Whoever you are, whatever your role, how do you drive system-wide change? Because, I think one of the saddest things, Michael, it's obviously sad that a lot of people at work are not able to bring all their humanity to work. But I'll tell you what would be the next thing on my list. It's really sad that most of those people don't think they can actually change the system in which they work.
It's like the Matrix.
And there's this deep helplessness that, there's nothing I can do. If the head of HR or IT or CFO or CEO is not like going to do this, then it all stays, it stays. And so I believe, and we tell some wonderful examples, very practical from some very complex organizations like Britain's National Health Service. How do you change the damn system when nobody's asked you to do it and when you have virtually no positional power at all? To me, that is the interesting problem. Maybe the most interesting problem in business is, how do you change the system and make it work for everybody, make it work for customers, make it work for stakeholders, even when, right, maybe some of the folks at the top haven't grokked it yet or compromised, and whether they really, how do you do that? And it's not an us versus them. It's not about, asking people to be like revolutionaries, but it is saying you have a responsibility to be an activist. You love your organization, you love your colleagues, you love your customers, this could be better. So like stop whining and start hacking, and then talk about it. Show what's been done, show the good results. And I can tell you, it will propagate, right? People are hungry for new and better approaches. It's not that, but they're waiting for people who have the guts to stand up and take the lead. And my experience is that can be anybody.
There's a nice example. It's a story you use of I think it was the National Health Services in the UK, where they had something called a pledge day. You just had to say one thing you're going to change and do consistently, and that's all you had to do, and it snowballed into a culture change across the organization. So I'm thinking that if you're struggling as a CEO or someone not sure how to do this, you can start with something fairly simple.
Yeah, that's exactly, and often with some real system-wide impact. There's a wonderful woman at NHS, 1.7 million employees, as bureaucratic as it comes.
Wow.
And she and a lot of young colleagues there were frustrated by the fact that a lot of providers there, carers, were spending more time kind of on bureaucratic tasks than caring for patients. And so they simply put up this little thing. It says a little pledge, one page, what's something you can do in your job to improve patient satisfaction outcomes. And they put this up on a little platform. They asked nobody for permission. They just did it. The first year they got 190,000 pledges. The second year, 800,000 pledges. And it became the single largest change program in the history of NHS because somebody said, I refuse to be helpless. I'm not going to spend time like negotiating the system. I'm just going to go around it. I'm going to I'm going to build a natural pro-change constituency for people who are ready to get involved. And, and today you can do this. If you go back, even a decade ago, Michael, most of the channels of communication organizations ran vertically.
Yeah.
And if being a leader meant anything, it meant that you got to control the conversation. Guess what? No more, right? No more. And so now most of the dialogue, the communication is horizontal. And yet, thus far, most of that horizontal is just really incremental and operational. So all these new tools, Slack and Basecamp and Microsoft Teams, whatever it may be, basically it's a productivity tool that's supposed to do for white collar teams what Microsoft Office did for individuals. Like, so we're just going to share documents. Fine, that's great. But there's a much more powerful thing you can do with that. You can find the people. You can start a conversation. You guys, hey guys, what sucks to you about our travel policy? What do you find? Hey guys, how can we start to change that? What might be a better idea? And what we find when we do that in a little bit more disciplined way in organizations, and we invite people into a process for hacking the management model, when you have 100 people or 50 or whatever saying this process doesn't work or here's a better idea, I can tell you nobody can stand in the way of that anymore.
Yeah.
Right? You just can't. And so a lot of making this change is learning how to aggregate the power of these new social technologies to bring people together, solve these complicated problems, but also, to be perfectly blunt, to overcome a little bit of the vested interest and the entrenched interest that so often are make it easy to kind of shut down individuals, but make it really hard to shut down a group of people who truly love their organization, want to make it better, and have some great ideas for doing so.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is that, anyone listening to this, you don't need to put together a business case for 4 months, send it to the CEO and the EVP to get permission to do anything. All you need is to get together with some like-minded people. You mentioned some of the technology tools, share ideas, make sure you all have the same passion for doing things, and just do it.
But here's what I've learned. In the individual, your capacity to make a change is almost entirely uncorrelated with your positional power.
Yes.
I know CEOs who launch enormously expensive, multi-million-dollar change programs and at the end achieve almost nothing.
Well, yeah.
Right? This is not about resources. People who change the world have 4 things. They have courage to tackle a problem that's bigger than their pay grade or bigger than their responsibilities, but they care enough to do that. Secondly, they're contrarian thinkers. They know that if a problem has been there for a while, like more of the same is not going to work. So they're looking outside. They're looking for interesting examples. They're learning from other disciplines, but they're trying to bring new thinking to the problem. Thirdly, they're compassionate. And so it's clear they're not in it for themselves. This is not about fighting their corner. And that means other people will take risks with them and give them some grace, when they fail or they stumble. And then finally, there are people who are community minded. They never think about how do I do this on my own? Yeah. They're always like Helen Bevan at the NHS. How do I find the influencers? How do I find let's mobilize. And if you build that in yourself, that the courage, the contrarian thinking, the compassion, and that community spirit, there's nothing you can't change. Honestly, there's nothing you can't change. So, and I find it amazing that, I meet all these CEOs who say, Gary, the world's changing so fast, we have to change faster. And I say, okay, yeah, that's true. So how many of your employees have you taught how to be activists?
None,
not sure anarchists, not terrorists, but activists, right? Oh, geez, we've never done that. Well, maybe that's where you have to start.
I agree. But just as a wrap up, right, the last point I want to make, it's an important point, and I'm sure you can talk to this better than I can. You need to be quite a mature CEO to do this, because you're passing down power to the front lines and you don't know what they're going to come up with. Not in a bad way, but you don't know what they're going to decide is the priority, what product mix they're going to go for. They're going to make money, but you are deciding that as the CEO, you're not the all-knowing God. Your ego is not attached to the fact that you worked with a McKinsey partner to come up with a strategy. Your value is that you create an organization that runs on autopilot and you just provide some principles. And I think that's difficult for a lot of CEOs.
Yeah, it is. And it definitely takes a lot of humility. When I was talking to some of the people at Nucor, I had a relatively senior leader there, at least in terms of, where they sat in the pyramid. And they have fewer layers and about 1/3 the number of managers in companies of that size is typical. But I talked to one fairly senior leader. He said, Gary, in this company, being a manager is the least noble thing you can do. It's our people who create all the value. And you have to get off on seeing other people thrive. That has to be, seeing other people grow and creating that, that opportunity for them to do so. And I think, leaders can still create a lot of value, but the reality is today, if you have to use your positional power to get things done, if you have to use the big stick of authority and sanctions and so on, your leadership capital is actually eroding.
Yeah.
Nobody has respect for that anymore, right? We have the most authority-phobic generation in human history, probably. And, if you don't know how to move people with persuasion and with appeals to higher principles and so on, you're not going to have any respect anyway. And so, yeah, it does take a kind of personal makeover, if you will. We call it detox for bureaucrats. But to say my role is not decision maker in chief, it is not head strategist. If anything, my role as a system architect, I want to think about how do I build the incentives, the tools, the platforms that allow people to reach their own goals. It's much less Jack Welch and much more Jimmy Wales, right, who created Wikipedia and said, I'm not going to write all Wikipedia. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I sure would like to create something that allows the world's knowledge to come together. So if that's what turns you on, then, and you can make a contribution, people are going to respect you in your organization. But like everywhere else today, Every place you go, you get rated. When I was a young faculty member at the London Business School, the first year I taught there, 1983, way before the internet.
Yeah.
But I realized at the end of my first term, every single student, 100 students, gave me a rating. And those all went into the library and everybody else could see them.
Yeah.
I understand that in that role, if I have any authority, if I have any clout, it's because people have said, hey, Gary knows what he's doing, or we like the way he teaches, or he's a good guy. But there's no positional authority that is useful at all to me. And I think that's more and more and more the case. In an extraordinarily complex world, moving at light speed, executive authority is worth very, 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 very little.
Yeah.
But the ability to inspire and motivate and protect and mentor, this is extraordinarily valuable.
Okay, fantastic.
So that sounds like the buzzer on my end. I'm actually late to another call. But,
thank you so much, Gary. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.
Oh, I loved it too. Thank you. You're so perceptive. Wonderful questions. And let me know when it's up, and we'll hope your listeners will enjoy it.
Take care, Gary.